It was a quiet Tuesday night in the Bay Area when Steph Curry received one of the most difficult questions of his life. It didn't come from an aggressive journalist after a painful loss, nor from a critic trying to provoke him at a press conference. It came from someone much more important and much more innocent than any reporter, his 13-year-old son, Canon. You can perceive that the most challenging moments of parenthood rarely happen when we're prepared for them. They arrive during ordinary dinners, in casual conversations, when our children ask questions that force us to confront truths we'd prefer to keep hidden. The Curry family was gathered around the dinner table at their home in Atherton, California. Issha had prepared one of the kids' favorite dishes, chicken with sweet potatoes, and the atmosphere was light and relaxed. Riley, at 21 years old, was telling funny stories from college. Ryan, at 18, was showing videos of her volleyball training. Canon, the youngest, was quieter than usual, absent-mindedly picking at his food. "Canon, you okay, buddy?" Steph asked, noticing that his youngest son seemed lost in thoughts too deep for a 13-year-old child. Canon looked up, and Steph could see in his eyes a mixture of confusion and sadness that immediately activated all his protective paternal instincts. It was that expression children make when they discover that the world isn't as fair and gentle as they believed. "Dad," Canon said, hesitantly, as if gathering courage to ask a question that had been bothering him for days. "I was watching some old videos of you on YouTube, and then I read some comments." Steph felt his stomach tighten. He knew exactly where that conversation was headed, and it wasn't a place he wanted to take his children. How is it possible that human cruelty finds ways to leak even into the most protected corners of our family lives? "Why did some people hate you so much when you started in the NBA?" Canon asked, his voice loaded with genuine perplexity. "Like, I read comments from people saying horrible things about you, calling you lucky, saying you didn't deserve to be there, that you were too small, too weak. Why were people so mean?" The silence that followed was heavy as lead. Riley and Ryan stopped eating and looked at their father, also curious about how he would respond. Issha gently placed her hand on Steph's arm, a silent gesture of support that said, "I'm here with you." Something that touches deeply is realizing that our children, no matter how much we try to protect them, will eventually discover that there are people in the world capable of gratuitous cruelty, of unfair judgments, of hatred directed at those who dare to be different or extraordinary. Steph took a sip of water, buying himself a few seconds to organize his thoughts. As a father, he had always known this day would come. The day when he would have to explain to his children that not everyone would love them, that success comes accompanied by criticism, and that sometimes people hate us not for what we did wrong, but for what we represent as threatening to their own limitations. "Canon," Steph began, his voice softer than usual, "that's a very important question, and it deserves an honest answer. Have you ever wondered what it's like to explain to a child that the world can be unfair to those who stand out?" Steph was facing exactly that challenge: how to share painful truths about human nature without destroying his son's natural innocence and optimism. "The truth is that when I started in the NBA, many people really didn't believe in me," Steph said, choosing each word carefully. "I was different from other players, smaller, thinner, with a playing style that had never been seen before. And when people see something different, sometimes they react with fear." "But why fear?" Canon asked, his genuine confusion breaking Steph's heart. "Because, son, when someone like me, who didn't fit the traditional mold of what a basketball player should be, started to succeed, it forced people to question their own beliefs about what was possible. And questioning our beliefs is uncomfortable. It's easier to attack the person who makes us question than to accept that maybe we were wrong. Naturally, this leads us to understand that Steph was navigating complex emotional territory. As a father, he wanted to protect Canon from the world's cruelty. As a mentor, he knew he needed to prepare his son for a reality where he wouldn't always be understood or accepted. "I remember one specific night," Steph continued, his voice carrying the weight of painful memories. "It was in 2010, my second year in the league. I had played well, but we lost the game. When I got home, I did something I should never have done. I read the online comments about me." Riley and Ryan leaned forward, never having heard this story before. "What did they say?" Canon asked, although Steph could see that part of him didn't really want to know the answer. "They said I was an accident, that my good rookie season had been luck," Steph recalled, and Issha squeezed his hand tighter. "That I was too small to be taken seriously, that I didn't have NBA physique, that it was just a matter of time before I was exposed as a fraud." What's most impressive is how Steph could remember those comments with such clarity, even after all these years and all the achievements that followed. Some wounds of the soul leave permanent scars, no matter how many trophies we accumulate afterward. "How did you feel reading those things?" Canon asked, and Steph could see tears beginning to form in his son's eyes. "Devastated," Steph admitted without hesitation. "I cried that night. I cried because I was trying to give my best every day, working harder than anyone I knew, and even so, there were thousands of people who saw me as a joke." You can perceive that admitting vulnerability to our children is one of the most courageous acts of parenthood. Steph was showing Canon that even people who seem invincible have moments of doubt and pain. "But, Dad," Canon said, confused, "you're one of the best players in history. How could those people be so wrong?" "Ah, son," Steph said with a melancholic smile, "that's the most important part of the story. They weren't necessarily being mean out of meanness. They were reacting to what they didn't understand." Steph paused, organizing his thoughts for the most crucial part of the conversation. "See, Canon, for decades, basketball was played in a specific way. Tall and strong players dominating near the basket. When I came along shooting from places others considered impossible, playing in a way no one had seen before, it scared some people. How is it possible that innovation and excellence can generate as much hatred as admiration?" Steph was trying to help Canon understand one of the most complex truths about human nature, that we frequently attack what we cannot comprehend. "Your father," Issha intervened gently, "was changing the game. And change always bothers people who feel comfortable with the way things have always been." "Exactly," Steph agreed. "And when you change something important, especially when you're young and don't look like the people who did it before, you become a target." Something that touches deeply is realizing that Steph was teaching Canon not just about basketball or fame, but about a fundamental life lesson. That being authentic and extraordinary almost always comes with a price. And that price is often the misunderstanding and criticism of those who prefer familiarity to innovation. "So, they didn't really hate you?" Canon asked, clinging to the hope that his father hadn't been the target of genuine hatred. "It's complicated, buddy," Steph said, gently touching his son's face. "Some people really hated me, or at least hated the idea of me. Others were just expressing frustration or fear in ways that seemed like hatred. And some were projecting their own insecurities onto me." Riley, who had been quiet during the entire conversation, finally spoke. "Dad, you never told us that it affected you so much." Because you were too young at the time, Steph replied, and because, as a father, my job is to protect you from the world until you're ready to understand it. But now Canon is asking questions that deserve honest answers. Naturally, this leads us to the crucial moment where Steph realized he could no longer protect his children from the reality that success and difference attract both admiration and criticism, both love and apparent hatred. The hardest part, Steph continued, wasn't even the criticism itself. It was explaining to people like you, my family, why the world is sometimes cruel to people who are just trying to do their best. Canon remained silent for a moment, processing everything he had heard. Then, with the brutal clarity that only children possess, he asked another question that cut straight to the heart of the matter. Dad, do you still get sad when people say bad things about you? Steph smiled, but it was a smile loaded with years of painful learning. Sometimes, yes, but I learned something very important over the years. Something I want you to understand, too. What? That when people criticize you for being different, for trying something new, for not fitting what they expect, that actually says more about them than about you. And sometimes, son, being hated for the right reasons is better than being loved for the wrong reasons. What's most impressive is how Steph was transforming a conversation about criticism and hatred into a lesson about integrity and authenticity. He was teaching Canon that others' discomfort with our difference shouldn't make us question our value, but rather give us strength to continue being authentic. Tomorrow night, Steph said, after you finish your homework, how about we sit together and I tell you the whole story? How I turned all that criticism into fuel. How I learned to use others' doubts to build my own certainty. Canon nodded enthusiastically, and Steph could see that, although his son's innocence had been scratched that night, something stronger had taken its place. An initial understanding that the world can be complex and sometimes unfair, but that doesn't mean we should stop trying to be extraordinary. That night, after the aubergine children went to sleep, Steph held Issha in his arms and whispered, I always knew this day would come. The day when I'd have to explain to them that not everyone will love them, especially if they choose to be different. And you did it perfectly, Issha responded. You planted an important seed in his mind today. The seed that our authenticity is worth more than others' approval. But Steph knew that had been only the first part of a much longer and deeper conversation. Tomorrow, he would tell Canon the whole story, from the nights of tears to the moments of triumph, from devastating doubts to the unshakable confidence he eventually built. It was time to teach his son that sometimes others' hatred is simply the price we pay for refusing to be small in a world that prefers comfortable mediocrity to uncomfortable greatness. The next night, as promised, Steph and Canon sat together in the home office. Canon had finished his homework faster than usual, clearly anxious to hear the rest of the story his father had begun to tell. You can perceive that certain conversations between parents and children have the power to shape entire life perspectives, planting seeds of wisdom that will flourish for decades to come. Ready for the complete story, buddy? Steph asked, adjusting himself in the armchair while Canon settled on the adjacent sofa, with the total attention that only children give when they know something important is about to be shared. More than ready, Canon replied, his eyes shining with curiosity. I want to understand how you went from people hating you to everyone respecting you. Steph smiled, but it was a smile that carried the weight of painful memories he had preferred to keep buried. So, let's go back to the beginning, to 2009, when I was 21 years old and had just been chosen by the Warriors in the NBA draft. How is it possible that one of the happiest moments in someone's life can quickly transform into a source of constant doubt? Steph was about to take Canon through this complex emotional journey, showing how realized dreams sometimes come accompanied by unexpected nightmares. When I was chosen in the draft, Steph began, I was on cloud nine. It was everything I had always wanted since childhood. But soon, in the first days of training, I began to perceive that not everyone was happy with my presence in the league. Steph paused, allowing the memory of those first days to return with all its emotional intensity. The comments started almost immediately, he continued. During my first press conference, a reporter asked if I thought I had enough physique to compete against real men in the NBA. Another questioned whether my father had used influences to get me a chance I didn't deserve. Something that touches deeply is realizing how first impressions can be devastatingly unfair, based not on competence or character, but on prejudices about physical appearance and limited expectations about what constitutes success in certain fields. How did that make you feel? Canon asked, leaning forward. Confused, Steph admitted. I had worked my entire life to get there. I had broken records in college, proven my worth against some of the best college players in the country. But it seemed like none of that mattered. People looked at me and saw only a skinny kid who didn't look like a typical NBA player. Naturally, this leads us to understand how deeply rooted prejudices about physical appearance and playing style can blind people to genuine talent. Steph was facing not just criticism about his performance, but questioning of his basic right to be in that space. During my first year, Steph continued, I read everything, every article, every blog, every online comment. I know I shouldn't have done that, but I was desperate to understand why so many people seemed to root against me before even seeing me play adequately. Steph got up and walked to the window, looking at the garden where Canon used to play when he was younger. I remember one specific criticism that destroyed me emotionally. It was in December of 2009, after a game where I had scored 27 points and given 9 assists, one of my best performances up to that point. What did they say? Canon asked, although his expression showed he almost didn't want to know the answer. A famous analyst wrote that I was an entertainment trick that would work for a few weeks, until defenders figured out how to stop me. He said my long-distance shots were temporary luck, and that I would be forgotten faster than I appeared. What's most impressive is how Steph could remember those words with surgical precision, even after all the years and achievements that followed. Certain emotional wounds leave scars that never completely disappear, no matter how many MVP trophies we accumulate afterward. That night, Steph continued, I got home and cried in the shower. Not just because the criticism hurt, but because I began to question whether maybe they were right. Maybe I really was just a temporary anomaly, an accident that would be corrected by the cruel reality of professional competition. Have you ever wondered what it's like to carry doubts about your own worth while millions of people watch your every move? Steph was sharing with Canon not just moments of glory, but the profound vulnerability that few see behind public success. Your mother, Steph said, returning to sit, was my anchor during those first years. Every time I came home destroyed by some particularly cruel criticism, she reminded me of something important. What did she say? Canon asked. She said, Steph, they don't hate you. They hate the idea that someone like you could be bigger than their limited expectations about what's possible. It was she who helped me understand that much of what I interpreted as personal hatred was, actually, resistance to change. Something that touches deeply is how unconditional love can serve as a shield against the world's cruelty. Issha wasn't just comforting Steph. She was giving him a new framework to interpret criticism, transforming personal attacks into evidence that he was challenging the status quo in important ways. But the criticism didn't stop, Steph continued. During my entire second season, 2010 to 2011, it seemed like every time I had a bad game, the critics appeared in full force. See? We said he wouldn't last. His luck finally ran out. Time to send him back to college. Canon made a pained expression, as if each criticism were directed at him personally. How could you keep playing knowing so many people wanted you to fail? That's an incredible question, Steph said, and the answer changed my life. I began to realize I had two options: let the criticism destroy me, or use it as fuel to become impossible to ignore. How is it possible to transform emotional pain into productive motivation? Steph was about to teach Canon one of the most valuable lessons about resilience: how to convert external negative energy into internal determination. I remember the exact moment when everything changed, Steph said, his eyes shining with the memory. It was after a particularly difficult game in March of 2011. We had lost, I had played poorly, and the online comments were brutal. I got home devastated. Steph paused, allowing the tension of the story to build. Your mother was waiting in the living room, and when she saw me, she said something that changed my perspective forever. Steph, you can choose to be a victim of their words, or you can choose to use those words to prove they're measuring you by the wrong standards. What did she mean? Canon asked. That maybe the problem wasn't with me, but with the standards people were using to judge me. I was trying to prove my worth according to old definitions of success in basketball. But what if I created a new definition? Naturally, this leads us to the crucial moment where Steph realized he didn't need to fit others' expectations. He could redefine what it meant to be exceptional in basketball. From that night on, Steph continued, I stopped reading negative comments. More importantly, I stopped trying to play like critics expected me to play. Instead, I began to fully embrace what made me different. What's most impressive is how that mindset change didn't happen overnight, but was the result of a conscious decision to stop seeking external validation and start trusting his own vision of what was possible. During the 2011 to 2012 season, Steph recalled, I began shooting from distances other players considered impossible. I began playing with a confidence that said, I don't care if you think this is wrong. I know it works. And did it work? Canon asked, although he already knew the answer. Not immediately, Steph admitted honestly. There were still difficult nights, bad games, constant criticism. But something had fundamentally changed. I was no longer trying to silence the critics. I was trying to become so undeniably good that the criticism would become irrelevant. You can perceive that Steph was teaching Canon a profound lesson about how to deal with criticism, not by denying it or being destroyed by it, but by transcending it through consistent excellence that eventually makes the debate obsolete. I remember one particular interview, end of 2012, Steph said. A reporter asked me how I dealt with so many people rooting against me. My answer was, I don't see people rooting against me. I see people who haven't yet understood that basketball is evolving, and that resistance to evolution is natural. My job isn't to convince them. It's to play so well that evolution becomes inevitable. Something that touches deeply is realizing how Steph had completely transformed his relationship with criticism. Instead of seeing it as personal attacks, he began to interpret it as evidence that he was pioneering important changes in the sport. "Dad," Canon said thoughtfully, "so you never got angry at people who said bad things?" "Of course I did," Steph replied honestly. "Anger, sadness, frustration. I felt all of that. But I learned that feelings are temporary, while the way we choose to respond to them can shape our entire lives." Canon remained silent for a moment, processing everything he had heard. Then, with the clarity that only children possess, he made an observation that surprised Steph. "It seems like people didn't really hate you. They were just afraid that you would prove they were wrong about how basketball should be played." Steph smiled, impressed with his son's perception. "Exactly, Canon. And when you understand that, criticism stops hurting and starts making sense. It becomes evidence that you're doing something important, something that's changing the world in ways that scare people who prefer things to remain as they've always been." But Steph knew there was still one more crucial part of the story to tell: how he transformed this understanding into a life philosophy that not only changed his career, but that he wanted to pass on to his children. Steph got up and walked to his trophy shelf, not to boast, but to physically touch the achievements that represented years of transforming doubts into determination. Canon watched in silence as his father held the 2015 MVP trophy, the first of many recognitions that would come. "Canon," Steph said, returning to sit, "now comes the most important part of the story. Not how I overcame criticism, but how I transformed this experience into the most valuable lesson I can teach you about life. You can perceive that some moments between parents and children transcend casual conversations and become transmissions of wisdom that will shape future generations." Steph was about to share not just memories, but a life philosophy forged in the fire of adversity. "The truth about criticism," Steph began, "is that it teaches us more about who we are than any praise ever could, but only if we learn to interpret it correctly." Canon leaned forward, intuitively perceiving that this part of the conversation would be different, deeper, more applicable to his own future life. "Let me tell you about what I call the mirror rule," Steph said. "When someone criticizes you, especially in a cruel or unfair way, that criticism functions like a mirror, but not a mirror that reflects who you are, a mirror that reflects who they are. How is it possible that such simple insights can be so transformative?" Steph was distilling years of painful experience into a lens through which Canon could interpret future adversities. "Explain better, Dad," Canon asked. "When people called me too small or too weak, they weren't really talking about me," Steph explained. "They were revealing their own mental limitations about what they believed was possible. Their criticism said, 'I can only imagine success in one specific way, and you don't fit that way.'" Something that touches deeply is realizing that Steph was teaching Canon to see criticism not as truths about himself, but as information about the mental limitations of those who criticize. It was a master class in emotional intelligence applied to real life. "But Dad," Canon said thoughtfully, "what if some of the criticism was true? What if you really had things you needed to improve?" Steph smiled, impressed with the maturity of the question. "That's the difference between constructive criticism and destructive criticism, son. And it's a lesson that took me years to learn." Steph paused, organizing his thoughts about a distinction that had become fundamental in his life. "Constructive criticism," he explained, "comes from people who want to see you grow. It's specific, offers solutions, and is given with love, or at least respect. Destructive criticism comes from people who want to see you fail. It's vague, offers only problems, and is given with anger or resentment. Naturally, this leads us to understand one of the most important skills of adult life: the ability to distinguish between useful feedback that can help us grow and toxic noise that only serves to diminish us. During my first years in the NBA, Steph continued, I learned to ask a simple question about each criticism I received. Does this person want to see me succeed or want to see me fail? The answer always told me how to interpret their words. Canon nodded, clearly absorbing every word. And how did you know the difference? By the words they chose and the way they said them, Steph replied. Coaches who wanted me well said things like, Steph, you need to work on your defense because it's going to make you a complete player. Critics who wanted to see me. Fail said, Curry will never be anything because he doesn't know how to defend. What's most impressive is how Steph had developed a sophisticated filter to process feedback, allowing useful criticism to help him grow while discarding personal attacks that served no constructive purpose. But the most important lesson, Steph said, his voice gaining special intensity, wasn't about how to deal with criticism. It was about how to use the experience of being criticized for being different, never do that to other people. Have you ever wondered how pain can be transformed into empathy? Steph was showing Canon how painful experiences can become sources of compassion and wisdom that prevent us from causing the same pain in others. When I began to succeed, Steph continued, young players started coming to me for advice. Many of them faced the same criticism I had faced. Too small, wrong style, won't work. And I realized my experience gave me a responsibility. What? Responsibility? Canon asked. To never let anyone feel the way I felt in those first years? To use my platform to celebrate differences instead of criticizing them? To remember that behind every different player is a person who might be doubting themselves exactly like I doubted. Something that touches deeply is realizing how Steph had transformed his personal pain into a life mission, protecting others from experiencing the same rejection and misunderstanding he had suffered. Canon, Steph said, shifting to a more direct and paternal tone, I want you to understand something very important. One day, you're going to be criticized. Maybe for being different, maybe for trying something new, maybe simply for standing out. And when that happens, I want you to remember this conversation. Canon nodded solemnly, perceiving that his father was giving him tools to navigate future emotional storms. First, Steph said, counting on his fingers, remember the mirror rule. Criticism says more about who makes it than about you. Second, learn the difference between constructive feedback and destructive noise. Third, use your experience of being criticized to never criticize others unfairly. How is it possible that three simple principles can serve as armor against years of potential emotional pain? Steph was giving Canon a framework that could protect and empower him throughout his entire life. But the fourth lesson, Steph continued, is the most important of all. What is it? Canon asked, totally absorbed. That being hated for the right reasons is infinitely better than being loved for the wrong reasons. Steph paused, allowing the weight of those words to settle. What that means is that if you choose to be authentic, if you choose to be different when that's what your heart tells you, some people won't like it. And that's okay. Actually, that's great. Naturally, this leads us to the deeper understanding that Steph wanted to transmit, that universal approval is impossible and, more importantly, undesirable if the price is the loss of our authenticity. "Son," Steph said, placing a hand on Canon's shoulder, "I prefer to be hated for revolutionizing basketball than to be loved for playing safely and predictably. I prefer to be criticized for trying something impossible than praised for doing only what's expected." Canon remained silent for a moment, processing the depth of that philosophy. "But doesn't it still hurt? Even when you know you're doing the right thing?" "It always hurts a little," Steph admitted honestly. "We're human beings, and being rejected or criticized touches something deep inside us. But the pain of being misunderstood is temporary. The pain of betraying our authenticity is permanent." What's most impressive is how Steph was teaching Canon that there are different types of pain in life, and that some pains are worth it because they lead us to growth and fulfillment, while others only diminish us without purpose. "I remember a conversation I had with your grandfather when I was going through the most difficult moments," Steph said. "He told me, 'Steph, extraordinary people always face extraordinary resistance. If everyone is happy with what you're doing, you're probably not doing anything important.'" You can perceive that Steph was sharing not just his own wisdom, but transmitting lessons that had been passed through generations of the Curry family, a lineage of people who understood the price and value of refusing to be ordinary. "Canon," Steph said, his voice loaded with paternal emotion, "I want you to know that no matter what you choose to do in life, basketball, medicine, art, anything, if you choose to be exceptional, if you choose to innovate, if you choose to be different, you're going to face criticism." Canon nodded, but Steph could see in his son's eyes not fear, but nascent determination. "And when that happens," Steph continued, "I want you to remember that your father was also criticized, that the same people who now call me revolutionary and legend once called me lucky and temporary. That transformation of public perception is possible, but transformation of personal character is more important. Something that touches deeply is realizing that Steph wasn't promising Canon a life without criticism or difficulties. Instead, he was giving him the mental and emotional tools to transform inevitable adversities into fuel for extraordinary growth. "The last thing I want you to understand," Steph said, "is that when you choose to be different, you're not just changing your own life, you're opening doors for other people who come after you." Canon looked at his father with an expression of curiosity, mixed with growing admiration. "Today," Steph explained, "there are hundreds of young players who play like I play, who shoot from where I shoot, who dream dreams that seemed impossible before I proved they were possible. They can do that because I refused to accept the limitations others placed on me. How is it possible that individual acts of courage can reverberate through entire generations?" Steph was showing Canon that choosing to be authentic is an act of service not just to ourselves, but to all those who will come after and benefit from the precedents we establish. "So when you're criticized for being different," Steph concluded, "remember that you're not just defending yourself. You're defending the right of all future different people to exist and prosper in a world that prefers conformity." Canon remained silent for several minutes, clearly absorbing the magnitude of the lessons he had received. Finally, he looked at his father and said something that surprised Steph with its maturity. "Dad, I think I now understand why those people hated you. It wasn't about you. They were afraid that you would prove they were wrong about what was possible." Steph smiled, perceiving that the seed had been successfully planted. But he knew there was still one final part of the story to tell: how all these lessons translated into triumph, and how Canon could apply these same lessons in his own future journey. Steph got up again, but this time walked to a special shelf where he kept not trophies, but photographs of moments that meant more than any individual recognition. He picked up a specific photo. Him and Canon, when the boy was only 5 years old, both holding a basketball in the backyard of their home. "Canon," Steph said, showing the photo to his son, "do you remember this photo?" Canon smiled, seeing the image. "Of course. That's when you taught me my first real shot." "Exactly," Steph said, sitting down again. "And do you remember what I told you that day about practicing even when no one is watching?" You can perceive that certain moments of parenthood create circles that only close years later, when lessons planted in silence finally find their complete expression through deep and meaningful conversations. "You said that practice in silence is what makes performance in public possible," Canon replied, surprising Steph with the precision of his memory. "That's right. And that's exactly how I transformed all that criticism into achievements," Steph said. "While people debated whether I had enough talent, I was in the gym at 5 in the morning, transforming doubts into determination, one basket at a time. How is it possible that silent and persistent work can eventually silence all the voices that questioned our capacity?" Steph was about to show Canon how real transformation happens not in dramatic moments, but in thousands of small daily choices to keep growing. "The change didn't happen overnight," Steph continued. "It was gradual, like watching a tree grow. Each day I got a little better, a little more confident, a little more impossible to ignore." Steph paused, allowing his mind to return to those years of transformation. "In 2013, something interesting began to happen," he said. "The same commentators who criticized me began to use different words. Instead of lucky, they said consistent. Instead of temporary, they said promising. The narrative was changing, but not because I had changed who I was, because I had proven who I always was." Something that touches deeply is realizing that Steph hadn't transformed himself to please critics. He had simply become such an exceptional version of himself that it became impossible for any rational person to continue questioning his value. "Dad," Canon asked, "do you remember the exact moment when you realized you had won? That people finally respected you?" Steph smiled, but it was a complex smile, loaded with memories both painful and triumphant. "It wasn't one moment, son. It was a series of moments that built something bigger." "How so?" "Well, there was the 2014 to 2015 season when I won my first MVP and took the Warriors to their first championship in 40 years. There was 2015 to 2016, when we broke the regular season wins record and I became the first player in history to be voted MVP unanimously. Naturally, this leads us to understand that real vindication doesn't come from a single moment of triumph, but from a sustained pattern of excellence that makes it impossible for honest critics to continue denying the reality of what they're seeing." "But the moment that marked me most," Steph continued, "wasn't when I won a trophy. It was when a young player approached me after a game in 2016 and said, 'Thank you for showing me that players like us can succeed in the NBA. Because of you, I believe in my dreams.'" What's most impressive is how Steph had realized that his greatest victory wasn't personal, but collective. Not just proving his own worth, but opening doors for an entire generation of players who didn't fit the traditional mold. "In that moment," Steph said, "I understood that all those nights of crying, all that painful criticism, all that doubt, everything had been worth it. Not just because I had proven my point, but because I had changed what was possible for other people." Canon was absorbing every word. clearly understanding that his father wasn't just telling a story about basketball, but about how to transform adversity into purpose that transcends personal achievements. "But you know what was the sweetest moment of all?" Steph asked, his eyes shining with deep satisfaction. "What?" "In 2017, one of the commentators who had been cruelest to me in the early years made a public statement. He said, 'I was wrong about Steph Curry. He not only proved to be a great player, he changed the way we think about basketball. I apologize for doubting.' Have you ever wondered what it must be like to hear a sincere apology from someone who once caused us deep pain? For Steph, that moment represented not revenge, but validation, that choosing to persist through adversity had been the right decision." "How did you feel hearing that?" Canon asked. "I didn't feel anger or vindictive satisfaction," Steph said honestly. "I felt peace. I felt that the circle had closed, that all the lessons had been learned, both by me and by those who criticized me. Something that touches deeply is realizing that true emotional maturity doesn't seek revenge against those who underestimated us, but finds satisfaction in mutual growth and shared understanding that time can bring." "Canon," Steph said, shifting to a more direct and paternal tone, "now I want to apply all these lessons to your life, because you're going to face your own critics, your own moments of doubt, your own choices about how to respond when the world questions your worth." Canon nodded solemnly, perceiving that the conversation was transitioning from story to practical guidance for his own future journey. "First," Steph said, counting on his fingers, "I want you to understand that you already have something it took me years to develop. You have these lessons from the beginning. You don't need to learn through pain like I learned. You can choose to apply this wisdom proactively. How is it possible that life's most valuable lessons can be transmitted through generations, sparing our children from having to learn everything through painful experience?" Steph was offering Canon an emotional shortcut based on decades of personal growth. "Second," Steph continued, "I want you to know that no matter what you choose to do in life, whether you dedicate yourself to basketball like Riley is dedicating herself to studies, or whether you choose a completely different path, these lessons apply to everything." "How so?" Canon asked. "If you become a doctor and try an innovative surgical technique, other doctors might criticize you. If you become an artist and create something that's never been seen before, critics might not understand. If you become an entrepreneur and build something revolutionary, competitors might try to diminish you. Naturally, this leads us to the understanding that lessons about dealing with criticism and being authentic transcend any specific field and apply to any life lived with courage and originality. The key," Steph said, "is to always remember the 4 lessons we discussed. Mirror rule, distinguishing constructive from destructive criticism, using your experience to protect others, and preferring to be hated for the right reasons than loved for the wrong ones." Canon mentally repeated the 4 lessons, clearly committed to memorizing this framework for future guidance. "But the most important thing I want you to remember," Steph said, placing both hands on his son's shoulders, "is that you'll never be alone in this journey. Your mother and I went through this. We know what it's like, and we'll always be here to remind you of who you are when the world tries to convince you that you're less than that." What's most impressive is how Steph was offering Canon not just wisdom, but ongoing support. A promise that the lessons shared that night were just the beginning of a lifelong conversation about how to navigate adversity with dignity and strength. "Dad," Canon said, his voice loaded with emotion. "Thank you for telling me all of this. Now I understand that when people criticize you for being different, they're really revealing their own fears and limitations." "Exactly," Steph said, proud of the understanding demonstrated by his son. "And understanding that will give you a superpower, the ability to not take criticism personally, and use the energy other people spend getting offended to become even better at whatever you choose to do." You can perceive that Canon was absorbing not just information, but an entire mindset that could shield him from future emotional damage, while empowering him to use adversity as fuel for growth. "One last thing," Steph said. "In a few years, when you're facing your own challenges, I want you to come back to this conversation. I want you to remember that your father was also criticized, overcame those criticisms, and taught you how to do the same thing. And then, I want you to pass these lessons to your own children someday." How is it possible that a single conversation can plant seeds that will grow through multiple generations? Steph was creating not just a learning experience for Canon, but starting a tradition of wisdom, transmission, that could benefit the entire Curry family for decades to come. "Dad," Canon said, standing up to give his father a hug, "I promise I'll remember all of this, and I promise that when people criticize me for being different, I'll use the mirror rule, and remember that it says more about them than about me." "That's right, buddy," Steph said, holding his son tightly. "And remember, the tears I cried in those early years became the victories we celebrate today. Your own challenges will transform in the same way if you choose to learn from them instead of being destroyed by them." Something that touches deeply is realizing that this conversation represents much more than a father sharing memories with his son. It represents the transformation of pain into wisdom, of personal struggle into generational strength, of individual triumph into collective empowerment. That night, after Canon went to sleep, Steph held Issha in his arms and whispered, "I think we planted some important seeds in his mind tonight. Seeds that will help him weather any storms he might face." "You did more than plant seeds," Issha replied. "You gave him a roadmap for transforming criticism into strength, and a living example that it's possible to turn hate into triumph through authenticity and perseverance." Today, when people ask Steph about his greatest achievement, he doesn't talk about MVPs or championships. He talks about a conversation on a quiet evening with his 13-year-old son when he was able to transform years of personal pain into wisdom that will protect and empower the next generation. Because sometimes the most important victories are not won on courts or in stadiums, but in living rooms where fathers teach sons that being authentic is worth any criticism, that different is beautiful, and that today's tears can become tomorrow's victories if we choose to learn and grow instead of giving up on who we're meant to be.